They had been inseparable since college, three friends who carried their bond into adulthood, despite jobs, relationships, and the scattered rhythm of growing older. Daniel was the planner, the one who mapped routes and double-checked gear lists. Mark was the daredevil, impulsive but fearless, always chasing the next climb. And Elise was the balance between them, calm and deliberate, with a way of grounding the group when tensions rose. On the first weekend of June, they met at a cabin tucked near the Sierra Nevada trailheads, excited for a climb that was meant to be just another adventure in a long list of shared experiences. The morning was clear, skies washed in blue, the kind climbers dreamed of. They packed their ropes, helmets, and chalk bags with the precision of routine. At 9:17 a.m., Daniel sent a text to his sister. "Heading out now. Should be back by late afternoon." Elise messaged her roommate, a short note about how she'd check in after dinner. Mark, true to his personality, said almost nothing, just snapped a picture of the looming granite face and posted it with a caption that read, "Let's go." At the cabin, everything else was left in order. Food still on the counter, sleeping bags unrolled, phones charging on the nightstand. It was meant to be a short outing, a day climb on a familiar route. Nothing about it suggested danger. Witnesses later reported seeing them laughing as they walked past the ranger station toward the trailhead, their gear clinking softly against their packs, their stride relaxed. Nothing about that final sighting carried any sense that they would never be seen alive again. The trail they chose led to a popular climbing wall known among locals as Ridge 14. Dozens of people hiked and climbed there each week. Families with children often trekked the lower paths, while seasoned climbers tested themselves on the vertical faces higher up. To begin their climb, the trio would have followed a mile-long forest path that spilled out into open rock. But somewhere along that path, their story bent toward a darker turn. By evening, when they didn't return, concern was slow to rise. Friends assumed they had stretched the climb longer, maybe camping out by choice. Rock climbers often did. When Daniel's sister first noticed his phone had gone silent, she brushed it off as bad reception in the mountains. Elise's roommate assumed she had simply turned her phone off to focus. Mark's parents, long accustomed to his erratic patterns, believed he was just late. For those first few hours there was no alarm, just silence. The night settled cold in the Sierra Nevadas, temperatures dropping into the 40s. Still, no calls, no messages came. By 11 p.m., unease turned into genuine worry. Daniel's sister called the ranger station. Elise's roommate drove to the cabin and found the door unlocked, lights on, their belongings untouched. She tried to tell herself they were fine, that they'd appear by sunrise with excuses about losing track of time. But the sight of their untouched phones on the charger cut through those rationalizations. At midnight, the first ranger knocked on the cabin door. He took down names, ages, a description of their gear, and the time they were last seen. He explained gently that in most cases climbers simply camped overnight, that search operations typically began at dawn. Still, he promised to alert the morning patrols. The roommate sat at the table staring at the muted glow of 3 cell phones, imagining them out there in the dark, possibly huddled together against the cold, possibly already beyond reach. When sunrise came and the cabin remained empty, the search began. Rangers walked the path toward Ridge 14, calling their names into the early air. They found boot prints, but not enough to confirm exactly where the trio had gone off the trail. Other hikers who had been on the mountain that day recalled no encounter with them after the morning hours. For the first time, the reality of disappearance began to sink in. 3 people had set out, and none had returned. By late morning, family members arrived. Daniel's sister drove in from 2 hours away, clutching the text he had sent as if it could anchor him back into existence. Elise's parents stood silently by the cabin door, refusing to sit, their eyes fixed on the trail as though expecting her to appear at any moment. Mark's father tried to ask the rangers about statistics, survival rates, what the odds really were if they'd been caught on the rock overnight. The ranger avoided numbers, repeating instead that the search was expanding. As daylight stretched thin, so did hope. Helicopters circled, voices echoed through canyons, but the mountain gave nothing back. 3 friends who had walked into the woods with laughter were now ghosts in the timberline, their absence tightening around everyone who waited below. It was no longer a matter of lateness. Something had happened, and the mountain alone seemed to know what. By nightfall, a word hung heavy in the air: panic. Families who had once told themselves there would be explanations now struggled against darker possibilities. Had they fallen? Had they wandered off trail? Or was there something else, something no one wanted to say aloud yet, that had taken them away? The questions pressed down harder as the second night came, unanswered and unbearable, pulling everyone into a silence that felt colder than the mountain itself. At first light, searchers fanned out toward the parking area where hikers and climbers left their vehicles. It was a wide gravel lot pressed against the tree line, the kind of place that usually carried the hum of life, boots laced, car doors shutting, radios faintly playing as people prepared for their day in the wilderness. That morning, the lot was quiet, and their eyes fell immediately on a silver SUV parked in a row of 3. The license plate matched the registration from the cabin. It was Daniel's car. The vehicle was locked, windows clear, the interior neat. Nothing suggested a break-in or foul play. The back seat was mostly empty except for a cooler and a folded blanket. The trunk, however, told a different story. Inside, searchers noticed gaps where equipment should have been. Extra helmets, secondary packs, and a coil of rope were missing, gear that Daniel's sister confirmed they had carried with them. It lined up with what everyone hoped, that the 3 had indeed set out on their climb prepared, planning only a single-day route. But that hope soured almost immediately, because finding the car meant they had made it this far. What mattered now was where the trail had taken them. A ranger who had been on shift the morning of their disappearance was called to the lot. He remembered them well, 3 young adults, cheerful, asking about trail conditions. He had directed them toward Ridge 14, the popular face most climbers favored in early summer. He said they had walked off together, chatting, their packs heavy with gear, nothing unusual about them. That was the last time anyone could confirm seeing them. The path to Ridge 14 was one of the busiest in the park, a stretch of dirt winding through pines before opening into exposed granite. On weekends, dozens of hikers passed through. That day was no different. Families had picnicked along the base. Couples had made the hike. Other climbers had attempted routes across the face. Yet when investigators began interviewing every hiker who had signed in at the trail registry that morning, none could say they had seen Daniel, Mark, or Elise on the climb. Not a single memory of 3 people gearing up, ascending, or even resting near the base. It was as if the 3 had walked into the forest and dissolved before reaching the wall. The absence of witnesses rattled search coordinators. It wasn't unusual for climbers to blend into the bustle of the day, but for 3 people to vanish entirely from the view of a busy trail was deeply unsettling. Investigators considered whether the friends might have chosen an alternate route, perhaps an unmarked path leading to a lesser-known face, but that theory clashed with their planning style. Daniel especially was known for sticking to official trails, and still, no other hikers reported crossing them anywhere along the network of paths feeding off the trailhead. Search teams widened their perimeter. Dogs were brought in, sniffing through the lot and along the trail. Scent markers lingered at the car and faintly at the start of the path, but soon dissipated into nothing. No discarded wrappers, no water bottles, no accidental drops of gear marked their way forward. For experienced climbers, it was normal to leave little trace, but for investigators, the clean sweep of absence began to feel unnatural. By mid-morning, more family members arrived at the lot. They stood near the SUV, eyes locked on the vehicle as if it held some hidden answer. Daniel's sister pressed her hand against the window, whispering that his jacket was still inside. Elise's father asked over and over how no one could have seen them if the trail was so crowded. Mark's mother stayed silent, staring at the tree line with a look that suggested she already understood something terrible had happened. The rangers tried to manage expectations. They explained that people often underestimated how easy it was to step off a path, how a small decision could send hikers into isolation. They promised the mountain would be searched inch by inch. Yet the more time passed, the more everyone at the trailhead felt the ground shifting from confusion to dread. By noon, the parking lot swelled with vehicles belonging to volunteers and search crews. Helicopters chopped the air above the ridge. Teams carried radios, ropes, and maps calling out plans. The SUV sat untouched in the middle of it all, a silent anchor tying the three missing friends to a place they had unquestionably reached. Beyond that, nothing could be proven. For investigators, the lack of eyewitness accounts formed a hole at the center of the timeline. They knew the friends had walked away from the car. They knew they had intended to climb. But every step after that dissolved into speculation. It was the kind of absence that sent imaginations spiraling into theories of hidden falls, sudden storms, even encounters with someone who hadn't signed the registry. As night approached, the car remained under watch, its locked doors a symbol of everything that was stable and ordinary in their lives. Yet all the stability ended there, at that line of gravel where the forest began. Searchers carried on into the dark with flashlights and radios, trying to force answers from a landscape that had none to give. It was clear now that the disappearance had not been a simple case of lateness. They had reached the trailhead, they had started their journey, and yet the mountain had swallowed them somewhere between the car and the wall. That gap, those missing hours no one could account for, would soon become the most haunting part of the case. By the second full day, the search had shifted from cautious hope to urgent action. Teams of trained rescuers hauled ropes and gear up to the base of Ridge 14, determined to scour every possible route. The face towered in front of them, sheer granite climbing into the sky, its ledges casting long shadows. For many in the search party, it wasn't their first recovery. They knew how quickly an accident on rock could turn fatal. Yet as they scanned the wall with binoculars, nothing obvious stood out. No bright flashes of clothing, no tangled ropes, no movement at all. Rescuers rigged lines and began climbing systematically. They swept the most popular routes first, rappelling down sections, peering into crevices, scanning for gear that might have snagged. On one route, faint chalk marks caught their eyes, white against gray stone. At first, it felt like a breakthrough, clear signs that someone had been there recently. But when they followed the marks upward, they stopped abruptly, mid-route, as if the climbers had vanished mid-ascent. No anchors, no ropes, no falls visible below. It was as if their climb had been cut short in the most unnatural way. Helicopters thundered overhead, circling the ridge again and again. From the air, rescuers scanned for patterns, a crash site, an avalanche scar, anything disturbed. But the mountain appeared untouched, clean in its vastness, indifferent to the people scouring its surfaces. The silence was unnerving. Searchers often expected to find something, a dropped glove, a helmet strap, a coil of rope. Here, there was nothing. On the ground, rangers fielded growing numbers of family members arriving at the base. Daniel's sister stood clutching his climbing shoes, refusing to let go. Elise's mother walked up and down the trail, calling her daughter's name, her voice breaking with each repetition. Mark's father tried to force his way into the command tent, demanding answers, demanding to know why no one could find any trace of 3 adults on a crowded mountain. The rescue coordinators had no comfort to offer. As days blended, the search spread wider. Drone footage captured miles of ledges, narrow crevices, even hidden alcoves that climbers rarely approached. Still, nothing. Each new negative finding sharpened the fear that the case was not a straightforward accident. In climbing circles, whispers began to spread. Experienced mountaineers muttered that even a fall should have left behind rope or broken gear. Others speculated about foul play, that maybe someone had intercepted them, that something had happened before they even reached the main wall. Investigators resisted that theory at first, pointing to the chalk marks as proof the 3 had at least begun a climb. Yet those marks only deepened the mystery. If they had made it halfway up the face, where had they gone from there? Climbers didn't simply stop and erase themselves. The lack of evidence became heavier with each hour. Searchers combed the base for signs of a fall. They scoured talus slopes and tree lines, looking for broken branches, disturbed soil, or drag marks. Nothing appeared. It was as though the cliff had swallowed them whole without leaving a single scar. The families, exhausted and fractured by fear, set up tents near the staging area. They kept vigil, watching the cliffside through binoculars as if sheer will might make their loved ones appear. Volunteers joined in, carrying supplies, holding hands, whispering prayers into the thin mountain air. But for all the people gathered, The silence of the cliff remained louder than anything else. Every evening, when helicopters returned empty, the air grew heavier. At campfires, rescuers shared little with families, knowing words would not bridge the gulf of absence. Parents asked over and over how 3 people could vanish on a mountain crowded with witnesses. Rescuers had no answer. The truth was spreading uncomfortably. This was not a normal disappearance. By the end of the week, with thousands of hours poured into ledges, cracks, and air sweeps, the mountain still held its secret. The chalk marks remained the only fragile thread tying Daniel, Mark, and Elise to the wall. Everything beyond that point was blank. For investigators, it was as if the trio had stepped into thin air. For the families, it was a nightmare without an ending. The whispers in the climbing community grew louder, about sabotage, about people who had enemies, about the possibility of someone else being on that mountain. Those whispers followed the families back to their tents, gnawing at them through sleepless nights. No matter how many professionals searched the cliff, the only conclusion anyone could reach was that 3 young friends had been there, and then they hadn't. And no one could explain why. After days of fruitless sweeps along the face, attention shifted to something darker, something that seemed to tug at everyone's fear. Near the base of Ridge 14, just off the main climbing route, yawned a crevasse. It was a narrow wound in the mountain, difficult to see unless you stood directly above it, the kind of place a climber might stumble toward if they drifted off course. It was deep, silent, and unsettling, the air around it colder than the rest of the slope. When rescuers noticed faint rope marks leading in its direction, the crevasse became their next target. At first, the discovery felt promising. The grooves in the rock suggested something had been dragged across the surface recently, perhaps ropes rubbing under tension. It was a trace. Finally, a trace. But when searchers followed the line, their hope faltered. The marks ended abruptly at the edge. No equipment, no anchor, no continuation visible below. It was as if the 3 friends had been walking toward it, only to vanish at the rim. Specialized cave and rope teams were called in. These were people accustomed to lowering themselves into places most wouldn't dare step. They set up lines, helmets gleaming under the afternoon sun, and slowly descended into the crevasse. Families gathered at the perimeter, holding their breath as radios crackled with updates. One rescuer's voice echoed from below, walls narrowing, loose rock beneath their boots, the air damp and heavy. At nearly 60 feet down, they found the bottom. But what waited there wasn't the missing climbers. It was nothing. Just broken stone, pools of dark water, and silence. The water unnerved investigators. Meltwater from higher up the ridge trickled through cracks, feeding into the crevasse, collecting in shadowed pockets before vanishing underground. Could a body have been carried away through hidden channels? Could all 3 have fallen, their remains pulled deeper into the earth where no one could reach? It was plausible, but not entirely convincing. If they had fallen, why hadn't any gear been left behind? Why weren't ropes or helmets wedged into the jagged rock? Theories spiraled quickly. Some experts argued the crevasse was a trapdoor. Fall in, and the mountain swallows you whole. Others questioned whether the rope marks at the rim were real evidence at all or just normal wear from years of climbing activity. Then came the whispers of darker possibilities. Did someone cut their ropes, forcing them into the void? Was the crevasse not an accident site, but a disposal site? The families clung to every update. Daniel's sister pressed rescuers for details. How wide was the opening? How fast was the water moving? Was there any chance the 3 could still be alive further down? She refused to let go of the idea that they might be trapped in some chamber the rescuers hadn't yet reached. Elise's mother wept quietly at the edge, listening to radios sputter static as the team searched deeper crevices branching from the main crack. Mark's father grew angrier with each report of nothing found, demanding to know why a mountain this thoroughly searched could still yield no answers. When the rope teams finally surfaced, their faces said everything. They shook their heads, helmets streaked with dust and water, eyes hollowed from hours underground. They had scoured every chamber accessible. There was no trace of the 3 friends, just more stone, more silence. The absence deepened the fracture lines in the investigation. For searchers, the crevasse had been the most logical site, the last hope for a clean answer. Now, it only complicated everything further. To some, it seemed impossible that three people could vanish so completely without leaving anything behind. To others, it confirmed the idea that the mountain itself had mechanisms beyond human reach, hidden waterways, collapsing chambers, places where evidence was devoured by time and geology. By now, the whispers had turned into arguments among the search teams themselves. Some insisted the trio had likely slipped, their remains carried away by the underground water. Others argued it was implausible for three experienced climbers to suffer the same fate simultaneously. The tension was palpable at the staging area, radios buzzing with clipped exchanges, families pacing the dirt, eyes wide from sleepless nights. The crevasse had given them nothing but questions. It stood at the base of the ridge like an open mouth, its silence mocking the hundreds of hours spent trying to coax the truth from it. As the sun set on yet another day without answers, investigators faced the grim reality that the crevasse, like the rest of the mountain, was unwilling to give up its secrets. What had started as hope, a chance that maybe the friends were simply stranded, maybe injured but alive, was now cracking under the weight of darker possibilities. And with every unanswered question, suspicion began to rise, creeping in like the chill from that fissure in the rock, dividing families, rescuers, and the climbing community itself. With the search dragging into its second week and the crevasse yielding nothing, investigators shifted their focus from the sheer face of the mountain to the quieter details, the kind that often told a story when the wilderness refused to. Forensic teams arrived, specialists trained in reading subtle signs, boot prints, fibers caught in bark, fragments of gear snagged where eyes rarely noticed. The mountain that had seemed blank began to give up faint impressions, though none would lead to the certainty the families craved. Near the trail leading to Ridge 14, rangers marked partial prints in the soil. The impressions matched the tread patterns of climbing shoes worn by Daniel and Elise, according to families who provided spares from the cabin. The prints ran parallel to the main path for a while before fading into rock, where no further trace could be followed. Dogs brought in to track the scent followed briefly, but lost it near the edge of a boulder field. The silence of the dogs when they circled back without alert was almost worse than their barking would have been. It was a confirmation of absence. Attention soon turned to their phones. Forensic analysis of cell tower data revealed that all three devices had remained active until just after noon on the day they vanished. Then, within a span of 7 minutes, each one went dark. Not a slow fade from low batteries, not scattered losses of reception as they climbed, just silence, sudden and absolute. Investigators wrestled with the implications. Phones rarely die in unison unless by deliberate choice, accident in water, or outside interference. Families clung to the hope that maybe the trio had turned the devices off themselves, intending to focus, but the investigators knew better. The timing was too precise to dismiss. Around this time, a searcher combing an unmarked slope made a discovery. Wedged between two stones just off the main route lay a carabiner. It was weathered but unmistakably modern, a locking model climbers often used for belay stations. A closer look revealed faint etching along the spine, tiny scratches that spelled out initials. The letters MR had been scrawled in black ink, worn but visible. Mark Reynolds, one of the missing. The carabiner's position was unsettling. It wasn't on the established climbing wall or near the crevasse. Instead, it rested along a seldom-used section of rock that jutted away from Ridge 14, a route known locally as treacherous and rarely attempted. Old-timers in the climbing community recalled that path as unstable, its ledges prone to breakage, its anchors unreliable. For Mark's gear to turn up, there suggested that at least for a time the group had strayed off the main route, whether by choice or accident, no one could say. This revelation sent ripples through the investigation. Had the trio decided to push into riskier terrain, chasing challenge? Or had they been forced off route by something, weather, confrontation, or confusion? Families bristled at the suggestion that their loved ones had made reckless choices. Elise, they insisted, was always cautious, unlikely to follow Mark into unnecessary danger. Daniel, too, was meticulous in planning. The idea that all three had wandered willingly into a seldom-used path sat uneasily with those who knew them best. Searchers redirected efforts toward that dangerous slope, They rappelled down gullies, crawled into shallow caves, and brushed through thick undergrowth where loose rock crumbled beneath their boots. Again, no sign of the missing appeared. The carabiner remained the only clue, a solitary piece of evidence speaking louder in its isolation than it would have among many. Investigators pressed further into forensics, analyzing the carabiner for fingerprints or DNA. But days exposed to weather left little to recover. A few stray fibers clung to it, but without a clear match, they meant nothing conclusive. The search's greatest clue was also its most frustrating, a direction that led nowhere. Theories multiplied. Some investigators believed the group may have attempted the risky route and fallen, their remains hidden in terrain too unstable to safely search. Others believed the carabiner had been planted, intentionally or by accident, perhaps dropped by another climber long ago. But the initials carved into its side tethered it stubbornly to Mark and through him to the vanished three. At night, families gathered around lanterns near the command post, replaying the day's findings. Daniel's sister spoke of the phones, insisting there had to be some outside reason they had all gone silent at once. Elise's mother cried quietly, whispering that her daughter would never have left the trail. Mark's father clung to the carabiner as though it were proof his son was still out there, still fighting to be found. Yet as each day ended without resolution, the community grew more unsettled. Climbers who had once spoken of the trio with sympathy now whispered about possibilities no one wanted to admit. Conflict among the group, a hidden accident, even foul play disguised by the mountain's silence. The idea that the three had strayed off route gave shape to a theory, but not an answer. By the end of the second week, the evidence was this: partial boot prints, synchronized phone silence, and a single carabiner pointing toward danger. The picture that formed was jagged, unfinished, and it left everyone with the same question gnawing at them. If this was the vanishing point, where exactly had it carried them, and why had the mountain worked so hard to keep them hidden? With physical evidence dwindling and the mountain refusing to reveal more, investigators began shifting the lens inward, onto the lives of the three missing friends themselves. If the wilderness could not explain their absence, perhaps their personal circumstances could. Detectives sat down with co-workers, relatives, and acquaintances, piecing together fragments of their recent months. What they uncovered didn't provide clarity, but it opened cracks wide enough for suspicion to creep through. Elise had been restless in the weeks before the climb. Friends told investigators she had been considering a move overseas, a teaching position that would have pulled her far from the Sierra Nevada community where she had grown up. To some, it sounded like ambition. To others, like a quiet attempt to leave her old life behind. Daniel, meanwhile, had been under strain of his own. Records showed a mounting pile of debt, overdue credit cards, and missed rent payments. His sister admitted that he had confided in her about the pressure, though she never believed it would drive him toward anything drastic. Then there was Mark. Unlike the others, his struggles weren't financial or practical. They were woven into his character. Mark had always been the risk-taker, the one who laughed at caution, who pushed limits even when friends begged him not to. His old climbing partners described him as charismatic, magnetic, but also dangerous in his appetite for edge-of-the-line adventure. As detectives laid these details side by side, a darker picture emerged. What if this disappearance had not been a random accident? What if it had been deliberate, an escape, a pact, or something worse? Families recoiled from the insinuations. Elise's mother told reporters her daughter would never abandon her life or family without a word. Daniel's sister wept through interviews, insisting her brother was too responsible, too loyal to simply vanish. Mark's parents grew defensive, bristling at suggestions that his personality could have drawn the others into reckless decisions. Yet the whispers were out now. And in the echo chamber of online forums, they grew louder. Amateur sleuths began piecing together theories, posting late-night analyses of timelines, cell phone data, and the recovered carabiner. Some claimed the synchronized phone shutdowns proved a premeditated plan, that the three had staged their own disappearance to start fresh elsewhere. Others insisted that one of them, usually Mark, had orchestrated something sinister, pulling the others unwillingly into it. There were even whispers of a suicide pact, fueled by rumors of Daniel's financial struggles and Elise's talk of leaving. For every grieving plea from family members, there was a counterpoint in the forums painting the trio as architects of their own fate. These theories, while unverified, seeped back into the real investigation. Detectives were forced to ask questions no one wanted to hear. Could Daniel have seen no way out of his debt? Could Elise have wanted to disappear before her move? Could Mark, reckless and impulsive, have led them into a situation from which they couldn't return? The answers were never satisfying. Every friend, every relative contradicted one another. Elise's co-workers described her as excited for the future, not desperate to leave. Daniel's employer claimed he was stressed but still focused on his work. Mark's climbing partners alternated between describing him as bold and as dangerously irresponsible. Each testimony added fuel but no clarity. The tension spilled into the families themselves. At the cabin where they gathered in vigil, harsh words sometimes cut through the silence. Elise's mother snapped at Mark's father, accusing him of knowing his son pushed the others too far. Daniel's sister bristled at insinuations her brother was the weak link. At night, when searchers came back empty, families sat apart, each grieving in isolation. What had once been a united front of hope fractured under the weight of suspicion. Detectives watched it unfold with unease. They understood how desperation created shadows where none might truly exist. But they also knew cases like these sometimes did trace back to human choice rather than chance. They kept their theories quiet, documenting inconsistencies, pressing acquaintances for any sign of deeper conflicts. A former roommate mentioned late-night arguments between Daniel and Mark over money. Another acquaintance recalled Elise once complaining that she felt trapped between them, though she hadn't explained further. Small details, easily dismissed, suddenly became magnified under the lens of disappearance. For the climbing community, the silence of the mountain was no longer the only mystery. Whispers spread from the trailhead to climbing gyms across the state. Did the friends argue on the mountain? Did they fight, and had something irreversible happened? Some believed a tragic accident was the simplest answer. They had slipped, fallen, and the mountain concealed them. Others leaned into the darker narrative, convinced human conflict had played a role. Meanwhile, online spaces turned increasingly hostile. Strangers debated the missing friends as if they were characters in a story rather than real people with grieving families. Every detail, the synchronized phones, the off-route carabiner, the personal struggles, became evidence for someone's theory. And with each theory came division, both in the public and among those who loved them most. By the third week, the search itself had slowed, resources dwindling as the probability of survival dropped. What remained was less about recovering 3 missing climbers and more about trying to explain what had driven them into silence in the first place. And with no physical evidence surfacing, suspicion filled the void. For the families, this was perhaps the cruelest turn. They had started with fear, then grief, but suspicion cut deeper. It placed blame where they wanted only to remember love. It forced them to ask questions about their children and siblings that no parent or sister wanted to consider. Had they chosen this? Had they turned on each other? Or was it still possible they had simply been victims of a mountain that was unforgiving, impartial, and silent? The truth remained locked in the granite, but the fractures it created among the living widened with each passing day. The summer that began with urgency gave way to autumn with silence. Helicopters stopped circling the ridge, search tents were folded away, and the command posts emptied. Rangers told the families they had done all they could. The mountain had been swept, combed, and scanned by every method available. Yet nothing new had surfaced. 3 friends had gone into the wilderness, and the wilderness had given nothing back. By the first frost, the case file was marked inactive, its pages filled with unanswered questions. In the first year, grief clung heavily to the families. They held vigils at the base of Ridge 14, candles flickering in the alpine wind. Climbers passing through sometimes stopped to listen as names were read aloud. Daniel, Mark, Elise, each syllable echoing into the dark like a plea that still expected an answer. The families kept their loved ones' rooms intact. Elise's mother never removed her daughter's hiking boots from beside the door. Daniel's sister still charged his phone every night, scrolling through old messages as if one more might appear. Mark's father drove the mountain roads every weekend. stopping at pullouts where climbers gathered, asking if anyone had seen something overlooked. The mountain remained indifferent. Snow fell, sealing cracks and gullies beneath ice. Spring thawed them, releasing only water and loose rock. For years, no evidence appeared. But from time to time, hikers reported strange, fleeting glimpses, an orange rope dangling from a distant ledge, bright against gray stone, only to vanish when they returned with binoculars. A flash of fabric deep inside a crack, impossible to reach. Some swore they heard echoes of shouting carried on the wind, though none could trace the sound. Each report stirred the families briefly back into motion, calling rangers, pushing for new searches. Each time, the searches turned up nothing. Authorities eventually closed the case as unresolved. The files were stacked into archives, stamped with the cold language of bureaucracy. No evidence of survival. Presumed deceased. Yet, closing a case on paper did not close it in the hearts of those left behind. The families refused to let the memory fade into silence. Every summer, they returned to the mountain, organizing memorial climbs in honor of the three friends. They hiked to the base of Ridge 14 carrying flowers, ribbons, and photographs. They tied strands of bright cloth to branches, leaving them fluttering against the rock as a reminder that the lost were not forgotten. For others in the climbing community, the story grew into something larger than a case. New climbers heard it whispered in gyms, told as a cautionary tale before they set out for Sierra routes. 3 went up and never came back, they would say. The chalk marks that stopped halfway up the wall, the carabiner found off route, the synchronized phone's silence. Details were repeated so often they hardened into legend. Some spoke of it with awe, others with unease. The mountain had claimed many lives before, but rarely so completely, without trace. As the years stacked on, the tragedy wove itself into the identity of Ridge 14. Climbers sometimes left offerings at the base, an extra carabiner, a note scribbled on paper tucked under stones. Others carried a kind of superstition, refusing to climb the wall at all, believing it marked. Rangers, too, noticed the shift. Every time a new incident occurred, a minor fall, a lost hiker, families of victims would bring up Daniel, Mark, and Elise, pointing to their disappearance as proof that the mountain always had secrets. The families aged under the weight of waiting. Elise's mother's hair turned gray in the photographs taken each summer at the memorial climbs. Daniel's sister eventually married, had children, but still carried a pendant with her brother's initials pressed against her chest. Mark's father grew quiet, his once angry demands replaced by a silence that spoke louder than words. They still met together, bound not just by grief but by a peculiar kind of solidarity. They didn't always agree on what had happened, but they understood the unique ache of not knowing. 10 years is a long time in ordinary life, but in the context of disappearance, it feels like a suspended moment, stretched without release. Every anniversary reopened the wound. Newspapers sometimes ran features, calling the case one of the state's most enduring mysteries. The families gave interviews, their voices softer now. Their words edged less with desperation and more with weary acceptance. Still, beneath the surface, hope lingered stubbornly. Hope for a hiker to stumble across a backpack, for a storm to uncover a ledge, for something, anything, that could finally explain what the mountain had taken. The occasional reports never stopped. A hiker swore he had seen a shoe sole wedged in a crack, too far to reach. Another claimed she spotted movement high on the ridge, a figure in bright colors that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Rangers investigated when they could, but each claim dissolved into nothing more than rumor. Yet the stories persisted, feeding the legend, keeping alive the idea that perhaps the mountain had not been searched deeply enough. By the end of the decade, the case had shifted from tragedy to myth. Ridge 14 was no longer just a climbing route. It was a story told around campfires, a reminder to climbers that skill and preparation could not guarantee safety. And for the families who returned every year, it was still sacred ground, where memory and loss lingered in equal measure. The silence of the mountain, once unbearable, became part of the rhythm of their grief. But deep inside, that silence still carried a question, one that pressed harder with each passing year. If time had not been enough to bring the truth back, then what would? 10 years after Daniel, Mark, and Elise vanished, the mountain still carried their absence like a scar, but it had grown quiet, settled, almost resigned to the silence it imposed. Then, in the late summer of that 10th year, the weather changed everything. A violent storm swept across the Sierra Nevada, the kind that strips trees bare and sends boulders tumbling down slopes like dice across stone. Days of torrential rain pounded the ridge, saturating the earth, loosening its seams until sections of the cliffside sheared away under the weight. The sound of rock collapsing thundered through valleys, sending dust clouds rolling like smoke into the sky. When the storm passed, the mountain looked altered, familiar lines broken, new scars carved where the rock had fallen. At first, it seemed like just another landslide in a place where landslides were common. But then, hikers who returned to Ridge 14 noticed something unusual. Along the freshly exposed rock face, near the area where the trio had last been suspected to climb, a narrow opening appeared, a crevice that hadn't existed before. And from within its shadow, something caught the light, a flash of color, fabric. The hikers moved closer, their boots slipping in mud, hearts pounding with the weight of possibility. Lodged inside the fissure, half buried in stone and dirt, was a strip of material. Bright, faded from years, but still unmistakably human-made. At first, no one wanted to believe it. It could have been a tent remnant, debris blown in by the storm. But the location, the precise alignment with the routes once searched, the history wrapped into that stretch of cliff, was too exact to ignore. Word spread fast, carried from hiker to ranger, from ranger to officials, until it reached the families. For those who had lived a decade in limbo, the news hit like a jolt of electricity. Daniel's sister sat down when she heard, unable to steady her breathing. Elise's mother, long resigned to silence, pressed her palms to her face and wept with a mixture of dread and relief. Mark's father clenched his fists, whispering, "Finally." After 10 years of offerings, vigils, and speculation, the mountain had shown something tangible, something that could not be dismissed as rumor or superstition. Authorities wasted no time. Rescue teams were dispatched with ropes, helmets, and cameras, retracing paths that had once carried only failure. The crevice was narrow and unstable, fractured by the storm's violence. Engineers studied the rockfall, marking areas too dangerous to cross. Yet despite the risks, searchers pushed forward. They knew what was at stake. The families, after a decade of silence, waited at the base of Ridge 14 once again, their faces older, their grief etched deeper. But their hope suddenly alive in a way it hadn't been for years. As teams approached the fissure, the strip of fabric became clearer. It was wedged deep, its edges frayed, its color dulled by dirt and time. One rescuer reached in carefully, tugging at it, but it held fast, trapped by stone. They documented it, photographed it, confirmed it was consistent with clothing designed for climbing. Beyond the fabric, the crevice sank into darkness. No one could see how deep it ran or what else it might conceal. The news broke publicly within hours. Headlines spread across local and national outlets. Clue found in decade-old Sierra disappearance. The story reignited interest that had long since cooled. Online forums exploded with theories again. Some called it proof that the trio had fallen into a hidden pocket of the mountain. Others insisted it was planted, evidence that someone wanted to reopen the wound. The frenzy mirrored the early days of the case, but this time there was something undeniable. Photographs of fabric, real and visible. For the families, hope and dread warred inside them. They gathered near the trailhead once again, this time older, quieter, their expectations tempered by years of disappointment. Still, the possibility of answers trembled in their voices as they spoke to reporters. Elise's mother said she prayed her daughter's name might finally be spoken in the past tense rather than lost in uncertainty. Daniel's sister admitted she feared closure as much as she craved it. Mark's father said only that he wanted to bring his son home. That night, as the rescue teams prepared for deeper descent into the crevice the following morning, the camp near Ridge 14 buzzed with unease. No one doubted that something had been revealed, but no one knew how much the mountain was truly willing to give back. The strip of fabric had opened a door, long sealed, but what lay behind it remained hidden in shadow. For the first time in a decade, the silence had cracked. The mountain had spoken, not with words, but with a fragment, a reminder that the three friends had indeed touched its walls. What remained now was the question that had haunted everyone since the beginning. What else was trapped inside, waiting to be uncovered? At dawn the next morning, rescue teams stood at the base of Ridge 14, preparing to descend into the fissure the storm had torn open. The strip of fabric still clung to its stone prison, fluttering slightly in the alpine wind as though beckoning them inside. The families gathered below watched in silence, their faces pale, their bodies rigid, as helmets clicked into place and ropes were threaded through anchors. After 10 years of searching, the mountain had finally given them an opening, but none knew what they would find once the darkness swallowed the first rescuer. The crevice was narrow, jagged, and cold. Each step downward brought the sound of loose pebbles tumbling into depths unseen. The air grew stiller, the light fading quickly until only headlamps cut thin beams against rock. Radios crackled faintly as the lead climber called out progress. 10 feet, 20, 30. Then came the first break in the silence. "We've got something." Above, the families froze. At about 40 feet down, wedged between slabs of stone, lay skeletal remains. The rescuers paused, their lights trembling as they steadied themselves against the walls. The bones were clothed in faded climbing gear, harnesses still buckled, scraps of nylon rope tangled around the frames. Time had stripped away flesh, but the position of the bodies told a clear story. 2 climbers had fallen together, tangled and locked, their ropes twisted like veins across the rock. Carefully, the team documented what they saw. A helmet lay cracked beneath one skull. Carabiners, chalk bags, and fragments of rope dangled still attached. It was clear these weren't hikers who had stumbled by chance. They were climbers, the missing climbers, preserved in the cold, dry stone where the sun could never reach. For the first time in a decade, there was no doubt 2 of the 3 had been found. Above ground, word spread quickly. Families huddled together as officials delivered the news. Daniel's sister collapsed into her husband's arms, whispering, "We found him." Mark's father stood still, staring at the ridge, his face a mixture of grief and relief. Elise's mother clutched a rosary in her hands, waiting for the next words. And then came the detail that chilled everyone. The rescuers had only found 2 sets of remains. Elise was not among them. The fissure went deeper, so the team pressed on, combing every chamber, every shelf of rock. But as they descended further, the absence became louder. No third body, no third harness, only empty stone. It was as though Elise had climbed out, or had never fallen in with the others. The mountain had returned 2, but held one back. Then came the most unsettling discovery of all. Near a narrow ledge just above where the 2 bodies rested, a rescuer's light fell on marks etched into the stone. They weren't natural cracks. They were claw-like scratches, raw and deliberate, gouged into the rock face. The pattern was unmistakable, lines dragging upward as if made by fingers, frantic and desperate, pulling for escape. Silence filled the radio for long moments before the description was spoken aloud. Everyone listening at the base knew what it meant. Someone had tried to climb out. The image that formed was unbearable. 2 of the friends had fallen, tangled in ropes, unable to recover. The third, likely Elise, had survived the drop, at least briefly. She had fought, scraping her hands bloody against stone, trying to haul herself out of the pit. How long she had struggled, no one could say. Whether she had made it part way before falling again, or whether she had escaped only to vanish elsewhere on the mountain, the fissure gave no answer. It only offered those mute scratches, frozen testimony of a last attempt. As the remains were carefully brought to the surface, wrapped in recovery bags, the families gathered in a circle. There were no words strong enough for the moment. The grief was immediate, sharp, almost physical. But alongside the pain was the strange relief of knowing. 2 had been found, their decade of absence ended. For Daniel's sister and Mark's father, the vigil had reached its bitter conclusion. For Elise's mother, however, the torment deepened. Closure had come for others, but for her, the absence had only grown sharper. Investigators analyzed the site meticulously. They measured the fissure, photographed the scratches, cataloged every piece of gear. Early estimates suggested the fall had been sudden, perhaps caused by loose rock dislodging underfoot. The tangled ropes indicated Daniel and Mark had been clipped together when they fell, dragging each other into the crevice. Elise, somehow, had not fallen in the same way, or had fought her way clear afterward. When reporters pressed for answers, officials gave cautious statements. "We have recovered 2 sets of remains consistent with the missing climbers," they said. "The third is still unaccounted for." But behind closed doors, even investigators admitted the truth. The scene raised more questions than it answered. Where had Elise gone? Had she died somewhere else on the ridge? Or had she managed, against impossible odds, to escape entirely? The scratches on the stone lingered in everyone's minds. They were more than evidence. They were a message, a haunting echo of a fight for life that no one had been there to witness. For the families, it was almost worse than silence. Now there was a picture of struggle, but still no resolution. The mountain had given back only part of the story. 2 lives accounted for, 1 still unclaimed. And in that balance of absence and discovery, the legend of Ridge 14 grew darker still. Laboratory results came quickly once the remains were transported from the ridge. DNA testing confirmed what the families already knew in their hearts. Daniel and Mark had been found. The 2 friends, tangled together in stone for a decade, were finally identified beyond doubt. Their names could at last be spoken in the certainty of the past tense. But for Elise, there was nothing. No remains, no trace, only the gouged stone at the fisher's ledge, hinting that she had once fought for survival in the dark. Her name remained suspended in the unbearable place between presence and absence. Investigators pored over the evidence, crafting theories to explain the fractured story the mountain had delivered. The most common suggestion was that Elise had survived the initial fall, clawed her way up the ledge, and escaped the fissure, only to perish elsewhere on the ridge. Perhaps she had succumbed to her injuries, lost in the maze of gullies and boulders, her body concealed by snow, landslides, or the shifting terrain of years. Others believed she might have tried to descend another way, her remains carried off by water channels that fed into unseen caverns. But without evidence, all of it was speculation. The mountain had answered one question while deepening another. For Daniel's and Mark's families, there was at least the gift of return. The remains were released, and the families chose to hold a joint service, acknowledging the bond the 2 friends had shared in life and the way they had been found together in death. Their coffins, small and symbolic, were carried side by side, the chapel filled with climbers, neighbors, and strangers who had followed the case for a decade. Photographs of their smiles, young, frozen in time, rested against flowers that seemed too bright for the heaviness of the day. Elise's family sat in the front row, torn apart by a grief that refused to resolve. They stood with the others, spoke her name in prayers, and wept with the same raw pain. Yet when the coffins were lowered into the earth, their daughter remained missing. It was a partial funeral, closure for some but not for all. Elise's mother later said it felt like watching the world move on while she remained stuck at the trailhead, still waiting for her daughter to appear. Investigators released their official statement soon after the funeral. They concluded that the trio had likely attempted a route near Ridge 14 that crumbled beneath them, sending Daniel and Mark into the fissure where they perished instantly or shortly after impact. Elise, somehow spared, had tried to climb free. "The evidence suggests she attempted escape," the report read, citing the scratch marks on the stone. "Her remains have not been located and may be unrecoverable due to terrain changes." The language was clinical, but behind it was an admission. The truth of Elise's fate would never be fully known. For the climbing community, the discovery settled little. It was a reminder of how ruthless the mountain could be, how even skilled climbers with strong bonds could vanish into its fractures. The legend of Ridge 14, far from fading, deepened into something darker. Climbers spoke of the scratches in hushed tones, imagining the desperation of that moment. They avoided the fissure, leaving offerings at its edge but refusing to linger too long, as if the silence itself demanded respect. For the families, the years of waiting had ended in a way both merciful and cruel. Daniel and Mark were home, their absence replaced with the finality of burial. Elise remained an open wound. Her family continued to attend the memorial climbs, leaving flowers tied in bright fabric to branches, whispering her name into the wind. Each time they looked up at Ridge 14, they saw not just the loss but the possibility that somewhere, hidden beneath snow or stone, the mountain still held her. In the end, the mountain gave back just enough to end the search, but it withheld what mattered most to those who loved her. For them, the silence remained, pressing as heavy as the granite itself. The story was no longer an active case, no longer a search. It was something harder, a mystery that would live on, half-answered, forever etched into the stone of Ridge 14.